Tra-la-la, that's right, everybody. Hi, this is Raph. I am in your English 218 class, and this is my presentation on the book of my choice for this project that we all had, and in this case, I picked The Adventures of Captain Underpants. I'd actually not known about Captain Underpants before, so I thought this would be a nice foray, but I have come across the novel. I just I didn't actually know anything about the story arc. So here we go. The Adventures of Captain Underpants, the first epic novel, which, as the title suggests, it's I cover the first novel. It's a novel by Dave Pilkey, spelled D-A-V, Dav, but it's actually pronounced Dave. And my title for this work is A Toilet Book for the Elementary Classroom. So let's have a look at the next slide. All right. So as you can see here, I've purposefully misspelled details. There's actually a lot to these books that is actually quite special, but the devil is in the details. You have to have a read of them, but I'll explain a little bit about that to you here in just a second. The Adventures of Captain Underpants, the full color edition, which is the one I'm reading, uh, of the first epic novel was originally actually published in 1997 as a black and white comic, but it was re-released in 2013 as part of an initiative by Scholastic and Dave Pilkey to colorize all the issues and re-release them. The full name of our author is David Murray, Dave Pilkey Jr., and as I said already, the publisher is Scholastic Inc. This series has actually been tremendously successful, selling over 100, or actually over 80 million copies, but close to 100 actually at this recording, in 20 plus languages. So all over the world, potty humor reigns supreme. At least for a time it did anyway, until about the mid 2000s, which is when things started to sort of taper off. It has been spun off into related series Dogman and Cat Kid Comic Club. And inside of this franchise, there is a DreamWorks film and a Netflix series. And the author, Dave Pilkey, is actually a multi-award winning author as well. Kids' Choice Award among those accolades. The first epic novel is a children's graphic novel. I like to call it a metacomic. It's a crossover or multi-genre graphic novel because it contains a lot. It's a very simple book on the surface, but there's a lot to it that isn't so obvious. There's a sort of a comic within the comic, and there's a lot of sort of hidden gems. There's a section inside of the book which is like I don't know if any of you ever read Mad Magazine, but there were some Easter eggs, if you will, inside of Mad Magazine, which is something that our author Dave Pilkey here actually was a big fan of as well, like yours truly. I read Mad Magazine a lot as a kid, and there was a like a sort of flipperama, or what he calls a flipperama, inside of Captain Underpants, which is a two-framer, and it allows the user to interact, as it were, with the book and kind of make yourself a two-frame animation sequence. It's pretty fun. The first epic novel is aimed at second to fifth graders, but it's variously advertised as being suitable for older children, young adults, or YA, and even old kids, which is something I like to term Y at age, or young at heart, people like myself. The novel is semi-autobiographical, drawing on the author's experiences being marginalized at school as disruptive, when he resorted to doodling comics as a means to comfort himself and pass the time, as diagnoses of ADHD and dyslexia made his institutional learning increasingly inaccessible. That really rings home for me because as somebody who comes from a family where we have comorbid diagnoses of ADHD and dyslexia as well as autism, that is something that's ever present. And having read his autobiography, I can closely relate to his struggles. But I can't draw. So, but yes, we have a family full of the same types of things. So very, very relatable. The author himself had a very, very tough time at school, with ADHD and dyslexia, and so he resorted to comics as a means to pass the time and to cope with the rigors of being in a school setting that he wasn't suited to or wasn't suited to him. The first novel, which is the one we're talking about here, The Adventures of Captain Underpants, the first epic novel, sets the tone, narrative pattern, theme, and visual and literal aesthetic for the rest of the series, with intentional spelling mistakes, lots of alliterations, and other accessible family-friendly wordplay, homages to other literary works, as you'll see by some of the chapter names. And most of the book is divided into short passages and chapters. So nothing's long, nothing's very wordy. It's very, very short and to the point, and there's plenty of action. So lots of conflict, problem solving, jokes, japes, and jocular adventure. Details, Part 2b. The novel has been praised by children, parents, teachers, and special educationalists for its lighthearted and sensitive regard for neurodistinctive or neurodivergent children struggling to foray into text-exclusive reading. So what that means is the curriculum nowadays is encouraging children to read earlier and earlier, which is a good thing in some ways, but encouraging children who might not necessarily be ready to read and alienating them early because they can't do that is a problem. And it has been recognized as such by people like Sally Shaywitz of the Yale Dyslexia and Creativity Institute. So with that, with endorsements for its content and especially for emboldening the genre while spotlighting the importance of inclusion in school libraries for struggling readers, despite numerous attempts to ban it, legions of adoring fans, and Pilkey's fixture atop sales charts, this novel and the rest of the Captain Underpants series are testament to uh, a met need long overdue. Pilkey and his Captain Underpants novels are not without their controversy, though. Critics and parents have argued the series caters nearly exclusively to boys, which in some ways it does. It is very boy-centric, and when asked about this before, Pilkey said, "Well, look, he was trying to stay in his lane," and he writes about being about the experience of boys growing up in an environment such as Jerome Horwitz Elementary, which is the school he goes to, or his fictional characters go to, because that's what he experienced. So he has said that he has tried to be as inclusive as possible, but because he doesn't have that lived experience, he didn't feel as though it would be appropriate for him to um, explore the character of a girl or a woman from first person perspective. Um, People have accused the books of being disrespectful of authority figures, anti-intellectual, vulgar and scatological in its themes and language, promoting of violence and a culture of practical jockish humor, and that it offers little in the way of learning outcomes and of sound moral takeaways. So those are a few complaints that have landed this book series on the banned book lists in 2005 and 2012, and I believe also 2013. So it's been on that list a lot. Additionally, allegations, albeit addressed, of passive racism against Asians were leveled at Pilkey with Scholastic's publication of The Adventures of Ook and Gluck, Kung Fu Cavemen from the Future. To his credit, though, Pilkey came forward with an apology as soon as the backlash was felt and pulled the books from shelves and had them pulped. Additionally, he offered all proceeds from sales that had already been made to go to Asian American charities and the campaigns to fight Asian American hate. Despite the ebbs and flows of triumph and the odd tribulation for Pilkey and Captain Underpants franchise, popular and critical discourse remains overwhelmingly positive. Of his work on this novel and the rest of its series, the following has been said, along with many other items of praise, but I only included a few here for time's sake. A lot of my students are very big fans of Captain Underpants, and I can see why. It is so funny. Dave Pilkey is a genius. All of the jokes in this book make me laugh. I hope Dave Pilkey writes for many years. And that was an elementary teacher who posted on commonsensemedia.org. In our fifth grade class library, graphic novels are the grand equalizers. They invite all levels of readers into reading conversations. Since everyone can read graphic novels, everyone can talk about them, and and talk they do. I love to witness how graphic novels allow everyone in the class to develop a passionate reading identity. Silliness is a rite of childhood. Instead of harping on and even firing teachers who promote nonsensical times, shouldn't we applaud a teacher who connects learning and silliness? Should our kids' safety and happiness and joy in school be more important than no potty words at the table? And that was a teacher who writes on a website called weareteachers.com, named Maddie Schuler. The space unintentionally left blank, or was it? That is the question. Captain Underpants, the first epic novel, a summary. Here are the principal characters. We have Principal Krupp down here, and we have George Beard. He is uh, the story master for the metacomic, also incidentally called Captain Underpants. And this is Harold Hutchins. He's the big bouffant, and he is the illustrator. Here is so there's the principal, the evil Mr. Krupp, who also doubles as Captain Underpants after a spell. After the hypnotizer ring hypnotizes him into being susceptible to the whims of these two boys, and they have a few ideas for what they want to do. And one of those things ends up being that they hypnotize him into becoming a character in their comic book series. And over here is Dr. Diaper, who for the first novel only is the principal bad guy. He is the arch villain, if you will. And the ultimate ending the end to this book, or the ending mission, is that the boys and Captain Underpants stymie or stop a diamond robbery or a gem robbery by Dr. Diaper, in which he was trying to destroy the moon with the theory that all the chunks would come down through orbit and land on Earth and flatten everything. So this story is set in and around the Jerome Horwitz Elementary School of fictional Piqua, Ohio, of the early to mid 90s. George Beard, flat top and tie, and the illustrator, and Harold Hutchins, blonde bouffant and writer. So I got that order of things messed up. I apologize, but yes. So Harold Hutchins is him, the blonde boy, and he's the writer. And the fellow over here with the tie and the ring, the hypnotizer ring, the flat top, that's George Beard, and he is the illustrator. They're best friends, neighbors, and a twosome of fourth grade pranksters who love to draw comics and wreak all manner of gentle havoc, generally bringing levity to their dull school life. One day they pull a series of pranks at the school's football game, which angers their principal, Mr. Krupp, past his limit. So at the end of his tether with them, Krupp threatens to release CCTV footage of George and Harold pulling the pranks they've pulled, unless they hang up the pranks and become his domestic servants for the foreseeable. To escape indefinite servitude, George and Harold order a hypno ring from a novelty company, which they use to hypnotize and transform Krupp into Captain Underpants, a superhero who fights crime. The newly heroic trio stop a bank robbery. However, Captain Underpants is captured by Dr. Diaper, a supervillain who plans to destroy the moon. The boys rescue Captain Underpants and stop Dr. Diaper's plan. However, they accidentally doubly hypnotize Mr. Krupp, and in the process can't seem to unhypnotize him out of being Captain Underpants, resorting to having to dump some water on his head, which puts him into a sort of halfway state, where any snapping of someone's fingers um, transforms him into and out of the state of being Captain Underpants, but he can't be unhypnotized. He's sort of put into a permanently hypnotized state. And George and Harold have to learn to they have to really think about ways to keep this a secret and also to ensure that Mr. Krupp and Captain Underpants are safe and able to go about their daily duality now that the boys have created for Mr. Krupp. Um, and that becomes a responsibility for them into the rest of the series, which incidentally follows a similar pattern of action in that the Mr. Krupp gets angry, and the two boys turn him into Captain Underpants to go on missions to fight crime. All right, moving right along. A big scene. In the first major transformation, George and Harold go from getting away with murder as their cavalcade of pranks, japes, and goofing off at school and silly streak a mile long catches up with them. They're collared by the ever-watchful Principal Krupp and the evidence he's collected of their capers. They cross the threshold from freewheeling innocence to facing down serious punishment. The boys had been in this office many times before, but this time was different. Quote, and that is a quote by Principal Krupp. This major scene is especially crucial as it serves to portend a pattern or dynamic of cat and mouse that drives much of the rest of Captain Underpants' series. I'm going to get those boys one day, vowed Mr. Krupp. One day, very, very soon. And indeed he does. Actually, the very next scene as it happens. Another big scene is not the very next scene, but a scene a little while later. In this scene, the Little Wise Guy Novelty Company's 3D Hypno Ring arrives by mail order, which is 46 weeks later, after the boys have been taken into servitude by a very evil Mr. Krupp, who has put them to work cleaning his house and cars and everything else as punishment for their capers at school. So in the scene, they get the Hypno Ring, and the boys have schemed that the ring will aid them in trimming down their 8-week or 8-year punishment to 46 weeks by hypnotizing away Mr. Krupp's corporal punishment, bloodlust. The ad for the ring promises that for a meager $4, a buyer could expect to, quote, amaze your friends, control your enemies, and rule the world, just like the ad says. And George succeeds in hypnotizing Krupp on page 57. And the boys take turns making him pretend to be zoo animals before lastly changing him into Captain Underpants for the first time. A moment later, after Captain Underpants emerges, donning cape and tidy whities, before announcing himself as the indomitable Captain Underpants, he summarily jumps out the window and goes in search of his first crime to crack. The boys panic and they go after him, worried they might have unleashed a much more problematic prank than ever before. There are several tropes inside of the Captain Underpants saga or story, if you will. Inside of this first book, particularly, it's quite a simple story with a hidden narrative or a sub narrative of another comic, but the most common tropes in the story are the beginning, which really does mimic a Once Upon a Time opening. It doesn't say Once Upon a Time, but it opens with meet George Beard and Harold Hutchins. So straight off, it's introducing the principal characters, and it tells you a little bit about who they are and what they like to do, and it also portends coming trouble. So I used Professor Nishimura's list for analyzing children's literature, which actually was very helpful. Looking at the prop list and the Bettelheim psychoanalytic list, as well as the uh, the list by Campbell. The hero's journey list isn't too bad, but the narratives was just too complicated, very difficult to try and work through. Um, the narrative I identified first and foremost was, yes, this once upon a time trope. It is present, and it's it kind of starts the story off in in a similar way to many other fairy tale type stories. Um, all right, let's move on. There is the next trope I wanted to cover is the one of a test. Chapters 6 through 8 proceed to detail how George and Harold's pranks, leading up to the disastrous football meet they'd sabotaged, are discovered by Krupp via a hidden CCTV system he summarily installed, and with the express purposes of catching them red-handed. Knowing that he has them banked to rights, he blackmails them into becoming his domestic servants for the foreseeable future, threatening to expose them as the saboteurs that they've obviously been caught out to be, which would earn them the ire and possibly beatings of a good part of the student body, including the the Knuckleheads, which is the school's football team. The boys will go on to endure 4 to 6 weeks of washing Krupp's car, clipping his toenails, cleaning up his yard, fanning him so he could cool off, and all manner of other things, as well as mountains of extra homework, while they're kept to an absolute minimum of um, any kind of personality at all while they're at school. They have to really just keep on the straight and narrow. They're quiet. They can't talk to each other. It's an ordeal. And this test forces George and Hal to have to troubleshoot what's going on in their lives to curtail what they see as an undue and unfair punishment. So this test is something that sort of shatters their innocence and forces them to grow up a little bit. And lastly, wit and wisdom. As a trope, wit and wisdom is rife, peppered throughout the series and throughout this book. It's actually pretty much on every page. There's something funny. So one of the most interesting things about this that includes a lot of humor, but it may escape um, really young readers possibly, is the the meta comic that the boys have drawn. It is a fascinating idea, and it runs in tandem to the story itself. But the boys have in their own treehouse written a Captain Underpants story that they sell at school. They sell the Captain Underpants comic for 50 cents and make lots of money from all their schoolmates, much to the chagrin and upset of their principal and their teacher, who you don't often get to see in the story. So I didn't. That's why I didn't introduce her as a character. Within Pilkey's Captain Underpants Book 1, the most utilized of any narrative trope within children's literature, with many examples, is that of wit and wisdom. The story makes use of a narrator who, on numerous occasions, breaks the fourth wall and speaks directly to the audience in a humorous way. Pilkey cleverly and hilariously at times embeds subplots, spoilers, and even advertisements related to the overall story arc in a secondary meta-narrative comic book, or metacomic, devised and sold by the protagonists Harold and Charles, which is also named and all about the eponymous Captain Underpants character. And within the story, the boys couple their silliness and love of adventure with bizarre bits of timing and luck to sum it up absurd, sometimes painfully funny outcomes. And I promise that's not off of the back of anything. That's just a summary of some of the wit and wisdom that tropes that are used within this book. So, as an example, the boys, once they've hypnotized their principal with the 3D hypno ring, they go through a drawer at his house and find some fake doggy do, which they end up using later on to to humiliate the villain into hiding away. So Dr. Diaper hides away in shame because he thinks that he had an accident on the floor. And while he's hiding, the two boys take the opportunity to save their principal and the superhero they've created, Captain Underpants. So the boys are growing up through the tropes that are employed here, and are have taken to troubleshooting things in creative ways and caring about somebody that they previously saw as their arch rival or their chief foil in Principal Krupp. So Hypnotizing him and bringing out the superhero in him has led the boys to see a different side to him and see him in some ways in a different light and as a different person. So they're growing. Lessons learned. The lesson to be learned from Captain Underpants, book one, is that being different and thinking differently, maybe even pulling a prank here and there to shake things up, if it'll get you through the mundanities or machinations of the institutional grind and keep you engaged in problem solving, building friendships, teaching yourself new skills, questioning authority figures and the norms they espouse, and making your journey as bright as you can by learning in your own way, perhaps even inspiring others while you do so, that's a good thing. Embracing differences and having an unconditional positive regard for the learning styles of others and respecting their social emotional needs makes our time together and our shared place in the sun that much brighter. While the story has been criticized for numerous flaws, as has the author for his, it is nevertheless a very human work, unabashedly showcasing vulnerabilities in people of all walks of life, without condemning them and without pitying them. Pilkey has acknowledged these flaws and has striven to course correct and make amends where needed. Perhaps the most important contribution Captain Underpants Book 1 leaves us with is that it normalizes difference and celebrates it shamelessly. And the author is unafraid of saying sorry when he has failed. In the America I want my son to grow up in, these values are as yet not fully prized, but they're closer than before to being realized or prized. And that we can get there little by little with a few words and a few pictures poking fun of that which we all take far too seriously is an achievement and lesson in of itself. So yes, there you have it. And here's a saying by our man Dave Pilkey. The only things I was interested in reading were comic strip collections, mostly Peanuts. Yes, so that's one of his big influences, Charles Schulz. Mad Magazine and joke books. I could sit and read these things all day long. Alas, my teachers thought those things were not real books, and sometimes they even took them from me. Back then, they didn't know all about the research that would be done this century about the value of reading for fun. Kids who choose their own books and regularly read for fun are more motivated, read more, and do better at spelling, vocabulary, and math. The amazing thing is that in these studies, it didn't matter what the kids were reading, or whether it was in their reading level or not. The only thing that mattered is that they were reading for fun and making a habit of it. When it comes to kids and reading, there's no such thing as a guilty pleasure. And here we have the boring bit. We're excited. There's lots in there. Lots of woven into this project. I hope you all enjoyed that. And I thank you very much for your time and attention. And I hope that you do well on your exams. Thanks, guys.